Very much, Joanne, and thank you for the last session, which was a brilliant preamble to what we're going to be talking about now. So we're going to discuss, and this is what Joanne has, the task she has set us, how art is a crucial lever of change in the campaign to mainstream environmentalism. Or indeed, we could discuss to what extent art is part of mainstream environmentalism, how art can evangelize about environmentalism, and so and how, if it is part of the same movement. And actually, I've worked in the environment movement and been told before that we're in different worlds. I think we're in the same world, and I hope we will be discussing that. So we've got three people of great experience here from different perspectives who are going to talk shortly, and we might indeed, apart from discussing their particular approaches, we might deal with some of the subject matter that comes up in terms of environment, the content and the contexts, and also the reception and the publics, and how the interface happens between art and the way it's received and by whom. And we might talk about the whole question of representations of identity and sense of place. We might talk about environmental justice and rights and activism, what kind of activism we want, and what's the relationship with the range of activism in terms of environment. Some ideas have come up already. Caroline Lucas said that art touches our hearts and we need hearts rather than heads. I'm not sure there's one excludes the other. I think we'll all agree we need both together. So I think there are maybe some conceptions about art that we will need to address. It's not entirely straightforward. Well, nothing is it? Anyway, so we've got, this brilliant panel here. So first of all, Heather Ackroyd. Heather is, I'm reading notes from Joanne. Heather is one half of artistic duo Ackroyd and Harvey. Dan Harvey is the Harvey, who create interdisciplinary works that combine art, activism, biology, ecology, and history. Besides local ecologies and anthropogenic climate change, they have a long-standing interest in the processes of germination, growth, and decay, explaining why their artworks frequently feature living plant material. Completely innovative, and you celebrated 30 years of that work recently. So, from the start of Ackroyd and Harvey's collaboration in 1990, the artists have received international awards and prizes and been widely commissioned for monumental living architectural interventions in the public sector. They've exhibited at the Hayward Gallery, London in 2023, Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in the United States, Royal Academy of Arts in London, Somerset House, Tate Modern, Ashmolean in Oxford, and David Attenborough Building in Cambridge, and many, many more, and big commissions and big projects, and also internationally, Australia and all around the place. So Frances Morris, we've just heard from, and actually really helpfully started introducing our subject, and that she has some very specific experience which is very relevant, apart from what Frances has talked about in terms of the transformation of Tate's international collection, broadening and diversifying its international reach and representation. And you might want to talk some more about the environmental implications of that. Since 2019, Frances has championed Tate's responses to climate and ecological emergency, exploring how cultural institutions can best respond and adapt to the complex planetary and societal impacts of the crisis. As board member of SIMAM, the International Committee for Museums, Frances was the founding chair of SIMAM's Sustainability Working Group until November 2022. And Kenneth Paranada, known to us as Ken, is the new Curator of Art and Climate Change at the Sainsbury Centre, the John Ellerman Curator, I believe. The position is the first of its kind for any UK museum institution. In this groundbreaking role, Ken is producing exhibitions that promote sustainability and engage with the climate crisis for a global audience. In addition, he's a researcher at the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research, University of East Anglia. In 2014, Ken graduated from Zurich University of the Arts with a Master of Advanced Studies in Curating before going on to Goldsmiths College, University of London, to receive a Master of Fine Arts in Curating with a focus on art in the Anthropocene in 2016. So now, I'm going to ask each of you to talk about your chosen pet project that's relevant to our theme of art and environmental activism. And then we'll come back to whatever emerges and talk among ourselves. But quite soon, I'd like to engage all of you in joining in our conversation too, because I think the audience has many people in it who have a lot of experience in this field, and I'm sure we need to share that conversation about what art does and what we can do together. So Ken, maybe if you kick us off with some of the really brilliant work you've been doing at the Sainsbury Centre and
Sounds
around
good.
that.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Veronica. So hello, everyone. At the Sainsbury Centre, we currently have Planet for Our Future, which is our first exhibition that tackles the complexity of climate change and how we're able to address it from a hopeful vantage point rather than from the bleak and doom and gloom type of scenarios we're in. It usually just causes a lot of so nostalgia or that kind of idea of anxiety of a changing landscape. And so at the Sainsbury Centre, since the introduction of our new programming, our programming is basically now question-based. We're asking big questions that society is very interested in addressing. So for the first one, we have, how do we adapt to a transforming world? And obviously that's such a big question. And so our approach at the Sainsbury Centre is to welcome new voices to address this question, but also to kind of create new framings and understanding of how art and culture are actually very important to progress, because this is where our fundamental values are inculcated, and the kind of byproduct of those things are technologies. And so I think our programming at the center obviously works with collection, and we want to kind of disrupt all of this very modernist logic into the Sainsbury Centre to highlight indigenous voices and voices that has been left out because of colonialization and empire, and obviously the Cartesian duality of understanding the world, that it's black and white, rational, irrational, colonized bodies and colonizers. So we're trying to break that pattern to create a holistic approach in understanding climate change, because climate change is not just happening here in the UK, it happens across the globe in different forms and with different consequences. So one of the strategies we're also employing is visualizing change and creating that idea of what a sustainable museum practice could look like. Again, art and climate change is quite there is no direct path to it. It's usually oscillating. It's usually very collaborative. We work a lot with artists, activists, scientists, but also people who have lived experiencing climate change and, for example, flooding from rural parts of the globe, or just having that kind of knowledge set of what to do when there's a flood, or if there are certain kind of scalable solutions that we could enact and do in our own daily lives to combat climate change. And so at the Sainsbury Centre, we're also doing or trying to develop a global network of museums interested in addressing this topic, because again, we recognize that it's not just one individual person who's going to solve this. It's going to be a collaborative effort to bring all of these best practices together and create a museum exhibition, or probably a gallery exhibition, that is varied, that is not kind of like told from one single vantage point of knowledge, but rather very plural. And we acknowledge that all of these things together actually creates a new form of knowledge, and that's what we're interested in. So I guess I'm going to start there.
Great, thank you very much. I mean, we'll come back. There are many issues raised there about the type of engagement you're encouraging. We'll engage with it, but maybe first of all, a word from you, Heather, and then on to you, Francis.
Yeah, so connective point between Francis and Veronica, Bridget, and there may be a number of other people in the audience as well, is Culture Declares Emergency. So I'd like to talk a little bit about Culture Declares Emergency, and I'd also like to talk about On the Shore, a collaboration that we did with the writer, author, poet, and activist Ben Okri, with XR Writers Rebel and with Tate Modern in 2021. So how many people are familiar with Culture Declares Emergency out of interest? Okay, so to introduce, it was launched in April 2019, but it was born out of Extinction Rebellion. It was born from Fridays for the Future, and it was born out of the student strikes, and I would argue, for some of us, many, many years, if not even a couple of decades, activism, trying to put what was happening around the climate and around the ecological emergency into the center of the cultural landscape. And XR lit that fuse. It was a catalyst. And we were there in 2018, and it was the first time that I heard and met Greta Thunberg. And it was the first time the word lock on, and when we've heard about lock up in the pubs, we've heard about, lock down from the pandemic, but this was a lock on, sort of came into my consciousness. And actually seeing people sit on the road outside Parliament, I was going, what's going on? What's happening here? And then I began to realize that people were obstructing. And it just completely seared into my imagination. And we were involved already with an activist group because we'd been trying to stop in our hometown of Dorking, where Dan and I live, drilling for oil or fracking for oil in an area of outstanding natural beauty, which we did win. But it took 11 years and over £150,000 worth of money into the High Court to stop that happening. Yeah, well, it happened. And the wins do matter. The wins are really, really important part of the activism. But it was a group of us who came together. We kind of came across each other. During the lockdown of Severn Bridges, Gavin Turk was arrested, and it was an extraordinary, brilliant, piercingly blue sky day. And there was this extraordinary cathartic release in that moment. We suddenly thought, God, we're not suffering on our own. So many other people feel this strongly about it. And there was something incredibly joyous about it. And that joy was somehow again erupted through this disruption during the Easter XR, when the pink boat arrived on, Oxford Circus. And I was just going, this is so surreal. This is extraordinary. And then seeing, all of these rebel bikers go by, and then seeing people stop outside, locking down outside the National Theatre with hay bales, and, and then music, and then the red people turning up. And I just thought it was the most phenomenal and extraordinary theatre activism that I've ever witnessed and been privileged to be part of. So actually, Culture Declares Emergency, we were a group of us from across the arts, and we put together a launch event, which was a white horse was what arrived on the day. It wasn't a choice to have a white horse. Dan and I grew some grass coats, but we worked alongside Extinction Rebellion, who locked the roads down. Somerset House, Jonathan Reiki actually said, I'm going to get told off by my board, but we're declaring here and now. And we stopped on Waterloo Bridge, and we declared climate and ecological emergency. National Theatre, South Bank Centre, Tate Modern, we took the horse in. Frances gave the blessing. We'd already done a recce on the place, but she gave a blessing, which was great. And then on to the Globe, who were quite difficult, actually. I don't think William would have agreed with it, but they were a little bit edgy about the whole thing. But we declared, and as Dan and I were leaving, we were driving back across Waterloo Bridge. And I remember this moment, And we were exhausted. We hadn't barely slept, up to 1 o'clock in the morning stitching the coats, up at 5, trying to do an explanation to somebody in XR about why we were using a horse. And there was a single clap, and I was shocked, and I thought we'd been hit in the car. And I realized it was a single thunderclap, and it was just at the point that there'd been a declaration, and I just thought, well, if there are going to be signs, if we are talking about the universe, if we are talking about Gaia Earth, then here we are at that moment, and I'll take that. But it's a testament to everybody who's been part of Culture Declares Emergency. It really, really is. Zena Edwards, who's a phenomenal poet and performer, sang in Tate. She held that moment. She held that moment, as did the activists. And actually now we're over 1,000 individuals who've declared, 600 institutions, and we have 13 hubs across the UK, Uganda, Hanover Culture have just done a whole brilliant Act Now, assemblies. So please join. We are a community. We are saying we are in societal collapse. It is happening. And actually recognizing it, admitting it, and saying it's happening is the first step in the journey. Whether or not we want to talk about a 12-step spiritual guide, you know, we're addicted to our life, we're addicted to consumerism. And actually there is a spiritual journey that I feel is involved in this now. There's a great community. You can put in, draw as much as you need, but it is there. You can be in service, and you'll be supported as well by the community. And I just want to talk very briefly about On the Shore, which just had me waking up in complete panics of anxiety at times. I thought, what are we doing? We came out of lockdown and suddenly we had all these projects. But again, held within the collaboration of people who place passion beyond profit, I suppose, and held not by conviction, but by care and love. I'd put it in those terms. And we shared imagination, and we just had some extraordinary, again, moments, not dissimilar to that thunderclap across the bridge, that I can't explain easily, and I don't necessarily want to explain, but I take it as signs and symbols, you know, that things exist, actually, that draw us to a place. And we grew Ben's words, can't you hear the future weeping? Our love must save the world, in the turbine hall, seedling grass for 9 days. And there was a ritual, a ceremony, and with 20 activists, whose names, I don't know the name of all of them, rolled it up, took it outside, and we placed it on the Thames and we floated it. And there was music, there was children's choir, Damon Albarn sang, Ben spoke, activists spoke, and we said, this is why we're doing it. And I hold that moment very, very strongly. And there's a film, go on to XR, Writers Rebel, Ben speaks passionately, and he said, science has failed, politics is failing, maybe education, so why not give love? Let's put love there, let's give love a try.
Brilliant. You're such a brilliant storyteller, Heather, and showing the power of, the individual artist at the heart of this, and the community that you've built around that, and the community, actually not just the activists and you are part of the activists, but it is about the stories we tell, that is really important, and the theatre we can produce, and the visual spectacle, which is, again, a real key element in the environmental activism that's been associated with art. And my kind of if we call them mainstream environmentalist friends, my mainstream pressure group environmentalist friends say that, you know, we kind of know about the politics, we kind of know about the commercial side, but culture has not been recognized yet in the environmental movement for the power it has to move people. So, Francis, what I'd like, now you've left Tate, you can talk maybe freely about what you might have done or would love to have done, or what Tate ought to be doing in terms of the environment, and what were your successes, but what were your frustrations, and where it could go next?
Well, okay, so I suppose, I mean, it's really wonderful to see these images, both the the white horse coming into the turbine hall and this project, which was absolutely extraordinary. Both of those projects were not just really important, but they were very powerful. Poetically, they were beautiful. And it's just, it's the most moving statement from Ben. And in a way, it's got to be very powerful art to have that power. And I think that's what I learnt over the period of working with Culture Declares and other artists, that the really effective projects were effective because they were so extraordinary anyway. So working with Cecilia Vicuna and her extraordinary Turbine Hall Commission to create these kipu, evoking the ghost forests of the Amazon, or forests destroyed by flooding. And the project that's on at the moment, which was the last project I commissioned for the Turbine Hall by, what's he called? Elanitsui, this incredible, wonderful curtain of bits of, waste metal. What I was trying to do in my role as director, but also as sustainability champion, was embed ecology and sustainability thinking, not just in programs that spoke to climate emergency, but across the whole piece. So that and some of those messages would have been barely visible. So when we made a Rodin show, for example, we worked just with the Rodin Museum and in Paris, so only a single lender. The exhibition was on for 6 months, not 3. We broke all the rules. We installed the work using materials that came from the trade, the building trade, and went back into the building trade. So the exhibition was kind of performing sustainability, behaving sustainability, and demonstrating to the powers that be in the institution that actually we could sustain a really major project with half the budget, half the resources, and half the impact that a conventional exhibition. And many of the exhibitions that I oversaw at Tate during my tenure had those sort of secret, well, not even so secret, those the impetus was to work in a different way. So just to give you so the idea that rethinking everything you do through sustainability was important. So one of the exhibitions within that context that I was most happy about, and it was the exhibition that I chose to be my last exhibition, was taking a moment from the history of modern art, where we think of modernism as being the moment where art departs from nature. And all those artists who worked in their studio far from the forests and the trees, and who are deeply urban, pared back Kantian sense of the autonomy of form. And so to take an iconic modernist figure like Mondrian, and by pairing him with one of his contemporaries, Hilma af Klint, and to rewild his practice by seeing it in the context of science and technology and thinking around evolution and nature of the period of his development, for me was incredibly important to rethink the way we think about the history of art. And we talked about earlier a little bit about sustainability. For me, sustainability is kind of about how do we take the past into the future rather than just ditch the past. And it was very important to break all the rules with Mondrian, which was to show his revered, incredibly iconic abstract paintings alongside his, for many years, suppressed and deeply problematic paintings of flowers. And, to discover for most people that all his life, Mondrian was painting flowers. And they were almost as important as his abstract paintings. And so the idea that, to think sustainably also does mean enriching the way we live.
Yes.
And that to me is incredibly important, because why else would people want to get on board unless they understand that we can live better and bigger lives if we address the climate emergency?
And actually, he was probably carrying those images in his head throughout the rest of his practice.
I think they're incredibly important, because he was thinking through nature.
Yes.
And so the exhibition was about how do you de-center the centre? How do you make Mondrian be a bit more cool and, ecological, and show that his work is very much a contemporary response to the spirit of his age, including spiritualism, which has been absolutely written out of his story, or very much, put behind a closed doors. People are embarrassed about it. But it's also about bringing marginalised figures like Hilma of Klint, who's always been seen as unclubbable because she didn't belong to the network of artists at that time, but she was a woman, so how could she have been part of that network? And of course, the network she belonged in was the network of ideas.
So it was a great example of how a reinterpretation, telling a new story, can bring into a wider focus something that people might have pigeonholed in a certain way, but you're broadening it to make it more accessible. It brings into play, I suppose, the role of, who's watching, and who's actually really part of it. We would love everyone to be part of it, but is that really happening?
But everybody should be part of it in different ways, and I think that's what you can do with a museum. You have multiple audiences who come from different entry points, and there are audiences who were completely captivated by Ben's poem and the grass, or the horse, or what you did with Boyce's Oaks and Acorns, or with Jenny Holzer projecting her great messages, if not now when, onto the front of the building. But there are also other audiences who think that that's just the activism, and but actually coming into an exhibition and encountering notions of ecology differently through the history of art, I think is equally important.
Can we come back to you, Ken, and thinking about, you were talking about how do we adapt, your big question, how do we adapt to a transforming world, but also the whole notion of indigenous voices, which are deeply embedded in the Sainsbury collection already.
Right, yes.
And you've brought out some of that in your exhibition, and there are issues of, again, who's speaking and who has rights. Can you talk a bit about that, and how that's being followed through, and also how that relates to what you're doing with the Tyndall Centre?
Right. In terms of indigenous knowledges and indigenous voices in the current exhibition that we have, so we have a commission from an indigenous artist originally from Peru, Claudia Martinez-Garay. She's currently based in Amsterdam now. And so we've commissioned her to look into the collection of Peruvian objects at the Sainsbury Centre and create a new work from it. And so the journey was quite adventurous because it led us to the British Museum. We had to look into the mummies that they have there, and Claudia was also interested in terms of this idea of repatriation. She's interested in this idea of climate justice, and obviously in the language of the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this is loss and damage. And so loss and damage is basically a terminology that was introduced in COP27 in Egypt, basically alluding to addressing historical wrongs. And historical wrongs are obviously about empire, colonialism, and the long-lasting legacy that we still experience in the contemporary time. And so Claudia created this amazing installation at the Sainsbury Centre, wherein she integrated all of these objects into her installation. You have sand, kind of, in the middle of the kind of installation. You have all of these objects that she has selected, are all from the northern part of Peru, to kind of create that aesthetic sort of connection, but then she wanted to cover them in sand to allude to that place wherein it was discovered. And so it's like talking about materiality. It's talking about all of these things that we dig into the earth itself, and a byproduct of that is discovering our past. But our primary intention is to get the coal out of that, or the oil and all of this sort of resources that we use for energy production in the 21st century. And so in that way, we're kind of like creating that institutional critique of allowing the artist to create an installation based on her understanding of how we could talk about this traumatic past. We also have an amazing artist that we're currently showing, Paulo Nazareth, and Paulo Nazareth is an amazing artist from Brazil, and the work we're showing at the Sainsbury Center is a documentation of his amazing performance in 2011 entitled Banana Market. And in that documentation that we have at the Sainsbury Center, it actually talks about the displacement of indigenous communities in the Amazon because of the rapid transformation of the place. Some of the Amazon kind of rainforests are being converted into banana plantation. And why is this kind of important to talk about? Because the production of bananas are impinged into consumption, and we wanted to kind of create that connection that in our daily lives, when we go to, your supermarket and you see all of this sort of amazing fruit in the fruit section, veg section, we want to kind of like link that with the idea of how all of this farming production affects indigenous communities, or obviously the ones that didn't cause climate change or anthropogenic climate change, but experiencing the brunt of all of this devastation. And also, actually, the first example you gave, there were echoes with thinking about Doggerland, as we were earlier, the relationship between the exploitation and archaeology. I've just noticed how the time is rushing by. I thought we had ages. So would you like to join in our conversation from the floor? We had masses more to talk about, but so do you. So, yes, maybe Bridget. Okay.
Turn the mic on, sorry.
I just want to add a little bit more about Culture Declares Emergency. It's not really a question, but you might want to comment. Culture Declares does also have an Eastern hub, and the East is 6 counties, so we're actually localising it to groups in both Norwich and Colchester. So there will be a cultural assembly coming up at some point this year in Colchester, so look out for that. Also, we've refreshed our declaration, so we now have 3 areas of values, and they are truth-telling, caretaking, and change-making. And so what that means is that we're focusing much more attention on acknowledging the urgency, the intersecting nature of this really urgent emergency. So we're encouraging more public engagement, more environmental content, more critical thinking, and the kind of dialogue that you've been talking about, Ken. In terms of caretaking, we're emphasising adaptation, because the climate emergency is impacting so much faster. We've got flood warnings constantly across the East. Also about palliative curation, so the role of museums or culture to work with communities in a supportive way to deal with the loss and uncertainty. And then the third area is change making, and that is to do with reducing your impact, not just in incremental ways, but really radical ways, really rethinking what we're doing and the structures of our work. And finally, about being sites of activation. So how can we activate people to create systemic change? Not this sort of take a tiny action after seeing this environmental show. It's about how do we support transition globally and locally so that we can live in much more kind of salutogenic and adaptive, resilient ways. So we're really going to be pushing out that message and working in partnerships, for example, with the National Museum Directors Conference, who have announced a kind of museum COP. So we want to be working with them. I'm sorry I went on so long. You might have comments.
Well done. I'd also like to see more bottom-up things coming out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it is. I mean, it is. Culture declares emergency is very much working through a distributive model, as you were discussing earlier.
And if we're
through the
going
hubs.
to encourage behaviour change, we have to find ways to spread ideas in a really fruitful way. I'm thinking back to what we were talking about, fashion. These are connected issues, and if you take a very broad view of where art sits, art and life, the connections between them, that's where culture declares can be really powerful. So behind you, I think there was somebody,
I just wanted to respond to the question about there are so many young people working in creative industries who maybe don't have that much agency to make too much change, or they don't feel like they do, but I know that they would really love to, and I wondered if you had any advice or if you had any thoughts on how people, especially young people, can implement this kind of change in their, whether it's museums or whether it's in their art practice.
You'll have to tell me, I'm not hearing it all.
Oh, okay. So the question was about how young people can be engaged with environment activism and be heard and make their voices heard.
Yeah.
Francis.
I do think there is a virtue in joining forces with Culture Declares. I mean, it's very difficult to do things on your own, but the power of the network and the power of solidarity. And I just know personally that I don't think Tate would have declared emergency had we not been really put on the spot by a group of artists. Not all of whom were in the collection, but we were asked some very difficult questions. And our response was to say, okay, we're on board.
Yeah.
And a number of projects that, I call them gift projects, that then came to us with artists saying, can I do this to your building? Can I light it up with this message? Can I put this on your landscape? Can I come into your turbine hall and do something? And the answer was yes. We were pushed to do it by people like you.
Yeah.
But you have more agency if you join forces with people who also share your concerns.
There's a great power in forming networks. There are some. There's Repeat, which is an organisation run by young people, they're peat activists, and it's global. There are hundreds of members. Frankie Turk is the key heart of that. So have a look. Repeat, that's one. But actually, club together with like-minded people and form your own.
Culture Unstained have been doing incredibly, brilliantly amazing work as well. BP, not BP as well. Liberate Tate. There's also architects declare emergency, music declares emergency. There's heritage is declared, business is declared. I mean, there's a lot that's proliferating out there. But actually having younger people, having a younger voice, having that energy, and, because, I'm in my 60s now. I'm going into some sort of like flooded sunset, but at the same time, so my choices potentially are slightly different, potentially. Young people are coming up, I came out of university with a degree with no debt. Well, I had a few £100, but it got paid off after a summer of counting traveller's checks, whatever else. But young people now have got debts. We used to squat places. We used to live in hard-to-rent council flats. We used to have housing co-ops. All of those have been erased because the property market now is so vigorous and powerful, and development is so strong. So a lot of the options we had to survive. And just to add here as well, that I know we're talking about sustainability and I know we're talking about resources, but many, many artists are broke. They struggle to support their practice. They struggle to make a decent living. I mean, DAX did a big data survey a few years ago. The average income for an artist was £10,000 a year. How are you doing that? You have to have multiple strings to your bow to be able to support that. Yeah.
Can I just ask that Ken to say a word, and then we have to wrap up, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
I think in terms of that idea, call to action, I think it's becoming aware of our choices, that our choices are actually the ones that influences all of the kind of complex systems of the world. And so if you decide to kind of like become more ecological and be part of the solution, then I think it's just like having that idea in front of your head, sort of making choices of who to support, what to buy, who to vote, and probably we could start from there.
Very good. I think we should finish there. Is that?
We've got more time.
Yeah?
Are we there? Is there one more?
We have a lot more time.
You had an hour. You had an hour, yeah. You were there, yeah.
That was
Oh,
hard.
the thing was, the counting time was going down. I was scared.
got time.
It was like,
More
Stephen.
questions.
Oh, okay.
More
Well,
questions.
all right. Well, actually, we could kick. There was something big thing.
There is a question here.
Oh,
actually.
all right.
More questions, yeah.
Okay.
Hi everyone. It's also just in reply to the young people and also reflecting back on climate justice and Indigenous voices. And I co-curated the middle space in First Sight, so the Earth Gather Form
Oh, fantastic.
exhibition.
Yeah.
And I was awarded, as a young person, awarded some money to create a project with the Bedouin community in Sinai on the land of the COP27. And a big problem that I found during my work there is that the term Indigenous gets bandied around at the moment. And as an Egyptian, but also as a British Egyptian, but also being a part of those places where indigeneity doesn't actually exist in the language of Arabic or within the indigenous languages. It is a multinational, multi-plural state with lots of different ethnic minorities. And when we say indigenous, we often think of Brazilians or Bolivians or Peruvians or people that have this kind of almost Orientalist in another way, sort of the way we kind of create the perfect indigenous person. So I'm just kind of reflecting on that note. And then the second point is that I worked and had access to this amazing building, and like you said, you kind of those gift projects where you can walk in and present your ideas to gallery spaces and kind of co-curate something with a group of young people that in both spaces it was a luxury to do.
Yeah.
But it is possible to kind of knock on the doors of places that almost look too big or too scary. So that's just a word of advice to everyone, really.
A lot of places like here have young people's groups. There's one at the Sainsbury Centre, indeed, that you can join. But that's a really brilliant project. And also, you're quite right to pick up on the term Indigenous, which is really used as shorthand
for other.
For all, exactly. But actually, I was in that part of London where the V&A is. That
Kensington?
No. The new V&A East. That
Stratford.
part of East London. Is it Stratford?
East, yeah.
Stratford East. And which is full of horrendous huge buildings. And, you could really see how we screwed the environment by what's happened there. But also, I was thinking there, what the indigenous population there has been displaced by that and, ridden roughshod over by that. So, there are indigenous peoples everywhere, including here. And it is a term that's misused. You're quite right. But yeah, I suppose it's a term for belonging. But yeah, you. Oh, sorry, you and then you. Yeah. You with the mic, yes.
I know, but I've also asked loads of questions. So if there's a limited amount of time, maybe it should be.
No, you carry on.
Okay. I think culture and the relationship between culture and the earth has been systematically targeted because it's so powerful. I think we see that in this country from the Inquisition and the papal bulls of the 12th, 13th, 16th centuries, and we see the same papal bulls having initiated the colonisation of other countries. I'm saying other, as in not the UK, and that the reason that attempt to disassociate people from the land and the expression of the land as conscious and intelligent being through the culture has been targeted is because it is one of the most powerful forms possible, I think, in terms of what it is to live harmoniously and equitably with the earth. And I do think that there is an incredible wealth of that connection between people and land and moving to different lands and listening in with different lands. And so I'm super excited by the things that you're presenting and totally going to have to come to all of your exhibitions and get off my butt.
Thank you. Does anyone want to respond?
Yeah, I mean, that the whole thing about reclaiming the commons. So part of the work that we were involved with at the Hayward Dear Earth exhibition, Art and Hope in a Time of Crisis. I have been quite long interested in the Enclosure Acts that started in this country from the 1600s and ran until the early 1900s, and over 5,000 Acts of Parliament were passed, which is basically taking land away from the common person. And that Enclosure Act has systematically created crisis after crisis because people were pushed away from land, from knowledge of land, from knowledge of place, into urban centres and cities, where they became bodies and labour for the expanding Industrial Revolution, which was brutal, completely brutal. And when I was trying to do some further research around the Enclosure Acts here and colonisation, what came up was Vandana Shiva's book, Reclaiming the Commons. And she just said, very simply, in one line, she said, colonisation is the Enclosure Acts on a global scale. And from India, she could see how the British Empire was moving in, turning around and saying land was wasteland, beautiful forests, but of course it was after resources, completely and totally dedicated resources, which is why Captain Cook sailed into Australia and declared it to be a wasteland, an empty land, and then could set around and then, followed after that by the first ships that arriving to set up the penal colony. And, this country is one of the worst countries globally for intact biodiversity. We have so many native species at risk of extinction. We have a highly industrialized agricultural system. I know there's been talk about this over it. So the piece of work we specifically did was we worked with London activists and it was soil, seed, air and water as the cornerstones of an ecological civilization. And some of them are quite embryonic, such as Grow Lewisham. Some have been more established, such as London Freedom Seed Bank, which is absolutely inspirational. They've been now growing climate-adapted seed, free exchange. It's really, really beautiful and fantastic project, through to 2 young activists who are trying to clean up the horribly polluted, poisonous air around the South Circular, and soil, seed, air and water. Paul Powellsland, one of the co-founders of Lawyers for Nature. So also just to mention, because I didn't mention it earlier, the Gallery Climate Coalition in terms of really good organisations who are doing some fantastic activism. But I also just want to make mention for environmental lawyers, Polly Higgins, Stop Ecocide, incredible. We now have an agreed definition of ecocide. Client Earth, Lawyers for Nature. So these are really, really important, and it's great for artists to work with these organisations where possible. They're part of the network, absolutely part of the network.
Can I just add to that? It is just, as I was saying to the question about how young people can get involved, artists have such agency that is not available to the people who work in institutions. Mm-hmm. So what we at Tate Modern were able to do on the back of Culture Declares was extraordinary, but also the story of working with a duo who call themselves Cooking Sections, who are dedicating their practice to eliminating farmed salmon from our oceans, and of course the ocean is another form of commons. Mm-hmm. And they were a duo who invited at Tate Britain to do a small project in the Art Now space there. Series of commissions from younger practitioners. As part of the project, they asked Tate Eats, the company who provide our food, to take salmon off the menu. And Hamish Anderson, who was the CEO of Tate Eats, agreed, sort of as an artistic gesture, sort of Duchampian gesture. Okay, we'll do it for 6 weeks. But 6 weeks went on to 8 weeks, and 8 weeks into, and salmon has never come back off the menu. But of course, it was like they found a crack in the system, and the team recognised that and recognised that there was something going on. And the project became a gateway to an interrogation of all the supply chains, of all the food and consumables within Tate Eats, and a complete transformation of not just the supply chains, but the menus. And now the next stage is looking at the supply chain of cleaning products. So a very small ask can have a very big impact when it comes framed as an artistic
and I
gesture.
suppose in an ideal world, that would spread to other
It
institutions.
has.
Yes.
I mean, then
Shared,
they
yeah.
were shortlisted for the Turner Prize.
Yeah.
And on the back of that, 25 plus Tate organisations made the pledge. The Serpentine Gallery took the pledge, and whoever, and I can't remember, and I probably shouldn't say it anyway, whoever provides the Serpentines, they're a chain, have also taken salmon off the menu. So in a very short space of time, a really major impact.
So there's someone there was wanting to ask a question. Yeah.
Hi, it was really a shout out for artists and, as you say, the agency that they have. And I remember at the Olaf Ullesson exhibition and the final video at the end of the exhibition where he's talking with the head of Greenpeace, and the head of Greenpeace was saying, you know what, you artists have a lot to teach us, the activist movement. And I think XR has done a beautiful and extraordinary thing, the way they draw together music and art and dance and painting and printmaking and all those wonderful disciplines to tease and delight and cajole the public to rethink their processes. And I wonder whether there is also something going forward that is going to be really important in terms of what artists do, which is hold the space for beauty going forward and the beauty of nature. Because as species are dying out and going extinct, there is something there that we need to hold, need to record, but also that the public needs. And also the importance of emotion in a work, and provoking emotion, because with emotion you have learning, and with emotion you have change. So if you wanted to comment on some of those things.
Thank you. I mean, I think we had questions in another session about how we use the term beauty. Not, it can easily slide into being a judgmental term, so we have to be careful. It's culturally constructed.
Yeah.
Bear that in mind. So yes, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, this kind of follows on actually from what you just said and what we've been talking about. And I hope I'm able to articulate what I've been thinking whilst I sit here. But I think there's something really important about art in that it allows us to examine our soul and also the darker sides of our nature. There's a certain perversity to human nature which is driving a lot of the destruction that we see in the world at the moment. And I think that it's almost a vital space for us to be able to explore and almost play with our shadow selves and unpick why are we driven towards these more toxic behaviours. And I think a chance to unpick that and unpack that as a society is where art can play a really pivotal role. And when we spoke, Heather, you spoke earlier of that kind of spiritual awakening, I think kind of dealing with those more negative aspects of ourselves is quite integral to moving into the light, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Actually, Ken, one of the works in your show really addresses that Australian work?
Caribbean Film Collective.
Is it?
It's an all-indigenous group from Australia, and they've been collaborating together to create their own narrative from their own agency and not from someone telling them what their experience is about. To kind of address that point, I think it's definitely vital and very important. And I think you're alluding to the future challenges of museums, basically. And it's that problem of imagining a future collection that will be important for future museum goers and And probably this is going to be the kind of coral atolls that is like disappearing as we speak, and all of this really depressing kinds of topics. But I think there is always hope in actually trying to create a collection that gives you hope and builds that resilience and that sort of idea of adaptation, that life is always evolving and transformation in culture always will happen, and we just need to be the museum needs to be flexible in addressing these types of changes.
But facing up to the dark side.
I think there's this, the Carbon Ruins project that Manchester uses. I think is a really brilliant tool case where actually what we need to do is imagine. We're not very good at thinking forward. Even my museum, it's forward plans like 3-5 years. You also need to think. You need to think, what is this going to feel like in 50 years? If I'm still alive in 50 years, how will I feel about my behaviours now? How will I feel about what I didn't do? And I think that's the way you reveal the dark side, just by imagining yourself looking back at it and thinking, was it acceptable?
Can I come back to the question of the young perspective? Do you pick up on the dark side or the hope, or where's your thinking going in terms of what contribution you feel you might make in terms of environmental activism or climate response?
I think, so I actually worked at Tate with a lot of visitors, and so I know the shows, but we recently had an exhibition of young people in China who created these drawings of what they feel like the future looks like. And I remember saying to my colleagues, isn't it so sad? We used to draw pictures of spaceships and flying cars, and all of these children instead have drawn pictures of the world basically on fire, which is absolutely terrible. So I think it's really hard to not feel pessimistic in a way. Equally, I know so many young creatives who are trying. But you brought up that it's financially extremely hard, especially in London, to be a creative. I feel optimistic, yet also pessimistic at the same time. It's very difficult.
Yeah. Economically, the whole thing, you brought up the whole question of money earlier on. It's the terrible thing about the art world, actually. I think it's appalling. And now I run a gallery on the high street. I'm respected as taking a risk on the high street along all the other shops, but in no way is my economy at the same level. And by no means are the general public used to buying stuff by artists. And I keep saying to them, if we want society to thrive, if we want artists to live as part of society, you have to buy their work. It doesn't make a lot of difference. Sometimes it does. But, we live in a capitalist system and we have to deal with it. But, I suppose the whole thing is about the ethics of that and what people are buying and what choices they're making. And as part of our environmental activism, we ought to think about that, the sustainable production. So maybe we could come on to think about what are the measures for sustainability, what are the benchmarks, what should we be aiming for in terms of art production, philosophically and practically. Is anyone going to...
I'm just saying there was a question up here.
Oh,
He's been valiantly raising his hand for a long time.
You're going to answer that. You're going to answer that.
Yeah, it adds to my question as well. So I think we've had some really, really fantastic thoughts about the place of galleries and museums, thinking about kind of raising awareness for nature, connecting to fighting climate change, but also kind of then trying to bring in, like, how can we have an impact on it? And that kind of brings me to think around, like, where are we heading now? Is it museums and galleries should be these places where you can have that complete journey of both getting connected to something, but then being able to be in communities where you feel like you can make an impact and being brought together, so that we're not just having perhaps an artwork which might make a difference, but that artwork in itself can exist and make a difference, but you can also then connect people and communities to that. So that's a kind of question I wanted to throw out there. Is that a vision that you see for galleries as being these hubs of a creative, sustainable journey of both impact and fun and beauty. Shouldn't have said that, but yeah. But making people feel good about it and actually feel like we are going to be able to survive this. So,
Well, I would like to think that galleries could have that, could have that kind of ecological sense of connections in and out, and be porous, and be relevant, and resources, and responsible, really.
I think to perform an ethical role, we have to be that gateway and that provide that connection through. Ken, and very quickly, because we're wrapping up now, Ken and then Heather.
Right. So for me, I think it's part and parcel of, progress. It needs to be culture. That needs to be ironed out, because again, that's where all of our repositories of our knowledge goes to, or the memories that we have. It becomes an object, or probably now it's a video or a film, cinema, the expanded film of art making. And so I think it's essential. Those kind of cultural heritage museum spaces will be an integral part in trying to create a new framing of what humanity is in the 21st century.
Heather, as a non-worker in a museum, you can have the last word.
Oh, my goodness me. Well,
A non-worker.
so just to say that within my practice with Dan, I think part of the reason that we survived without a commercial gallery supporting us, without doing all the art fairs, and without becoming full-time teachers, and it is tough, it really is tough, and worse since the pandemic and Brexit, of course, as I'm sure many people are experiencing. But we have a broad wingspan. Dan comes from Royal College of Art. He is a natural studio artist. He is a magician with materials. He has pieces in collection at the Sainsbury Centre for Visual Arts. I come from a performative, collaborative, networked way of making artwork. We're both committed to Boyce's Acorns, which is planting 150 trees in circles of 7, 21 circles across the country. We really hope that those trees will become a catalyst for the planting of 7,000 trees in total, which takes it back to Joseph Boyce's 7,000 oaks. For myself, I don't want boxes. I don't want my children, our children or family being left with loads and loads of boxes. I'd rather just leave trees in the ground or some reconstituted, healthy river or lake. I'd rather work with people on the ground. That's the direction I'd like to go in. And I don't want the object. I don't want the object.
Yeah.
Or where the object goes.
Well,
I want the living, giving presence of nature.
Reconceptualize what the museum is.
Yes.
We'll museumize, maybe. Bravo. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much.